plenty of time. There we go. All right, so today we are going to talk about causal inference, and I've kind of alluded to causal inference throughout our discussion of study design and everything else, but today we're actually going to talk about what we mean by causal inference. Who wants to take a stab at what we mean by causal inference? Anyone? Yeah.
Associating a cause to an outcome.
Yeah, so like actually saying that something causes the disease. So up until this point, we've really just been talking about, is an exposure associated with an outcome? Right? Is a risk factor associated with a particular disease? But we haven't really addressed the fact as to whether or not our risk factor or exposure actually causes the outcome we're interested in. So today we're going to talk about what types of criteria you really have to meet in order to be able to say that A causes B, not just that A is associated with B. So when we're doing epidemiologic study, we start with our descriptives, right? We start with our descriptive studies, we know how the disease is distributed in the population, which helps us form our hypotheses about that. Then we start to look at our correlational studies, which is what we've really been talking about up to this point. Our case control studies, our cross-sectional studies, our cohort studies, to look and see if the exposure and the disease are associated with each other. So, who here has heard the phrase, correlation does not equal causation? Who here knows what that phrase means? Who wants to tell me what that phrase means?
Well, correlation is just like if one present, then the other one might be present, or if one is increasing, if one variable is increasing, the other might be increasing, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it happens because the other one is.
Yes, exactly. No, that's exactly right. So it means that variable A and variable B, if variable A increases, variable B increases, or if variable A decreases, variable B increases. So the two are associated with each other, but that does not mean that variable A caused variable B. It just means that there are relateds going on. Now we're getting to the question where we want to know, is the association causal? So we've established that an exposure and a disease turn up together. They're associated with each other. Now we want to know, okay, does our exposure really cause our outcome? But there are certain criteria we have to meet in order to establish that. So just like we were saying before, when we're talking about associations, it just means that there's some way they go together. It could mean that this variable A increases, variable B increases. It could variable A increases, variable B decreases. But it means that there's some sort of relationship between those two variables. Now, causal inference is the process of deriving cause and effect conclusions. So we're drawing these conclusions about cause and effect by reasoning from our knowledge of factual evidence. So we generally don't have just one study that helps us determine that something is causally related to another. What we usually have is a compilation of evidence. We have a whole bunch of studies, and taken together, all of that information allows us to make a causal statement. And this is just a fun little cartoon. And most of you, I'm sure, notice in the news that every other day it seems like somebody's coming out with some information that contradicts the other, right? So it used to be you always put your baby to bed on their stomach because they were scared that your kid was going to vomit and aspirate. And then they realized, wait, everybody putting their baby to bed on their stomach increases the risk of SIDS, so put everybody to bed on their back. And it's just like this long thing, right? But so as we gather more evidence, things change. We change recommendations. But this is just a fun little cartoon that's kind of like, spin the wheel, and whatever your exposure is associated with your outcome. I don't know. You probably can't read it very well. You would probably read it better yourself. I thought it was very funny. You don't have to. You don't have to think it's funny at all. But it is very funny. I'm telling you. All right. So, when people first started talking about causal associations, they were really talking about, does a single thing cause another thing? So they were really talking about back when infectious disease when infectious disease was the most frequent cause of death, and infectious disease was really becoming prominent, we found out about germ theory, and we started understanding that an organism could cause an illness. And back in that point, we had the single cause, the Henle-Cope postulates. So, the Henle-Cope postulates for a single causal factor, you have to have the organism present in every case of disease. So if you're talking about HIV, or if you're talking about AIDS, HIV has to be present in every single case of AIDS. The organism can be isolated and grown in pure culture. So if I take a person that has AIDS and I take a blood sample, I can then grow HIV in culture. The organism must, when inoculated into a susceptible animal, produce specific disease. So if I take that HIV that I have grown in culture and inject it into a monkey, I think monkeys are susceptible to HIV, then the monkey would develop AIDS. And then the organism must be observed in and recovered from the inoculation. So then I take a blood sample from the monkey, and I can put that blood sample back in culture, and I can grow HIV again. So this is the full cycle. So this really corresponds only to when we're talking about infectious diseases. But this is, does our germ that we found, does the bacteria that we found in the virus found, does it cause the disease that we think it causes? Has to meet this criteria. Now, yes?
Is this like current? Is this still used?
Not really.
Seems like a lot of things that wouldn't have to fall into that category.
You're absolutely right. So this was kind of the origination of causal thinking. So when people first started to come up with the idea that we have to really establish that one thing is actually causing another, this is what they came up with. And this was really talking about, it was back in the era when chronic diseases were not really prevalent because everybody died by the time they were 40. And when it was really infectious disease, that was the problem. And these hold most of the time for infectious disease. Now, generally speaking, most infectious diseases are also multifactorial. There's other things, not sure they can cause, but there's other components that are related to whether or not you get the disease. But generally speaking, if you're talking about infection, this is the postulates that you have to meet, but it's not, this isn't really the criteria that we use today. This was, when we first started talking about causal thinking, this is what people were talking about. The problem is that most of the diseases we talk about today are multifactorial. They have multiple things that can cause them, and more than one thing can cause the same disease, right? But before we get to that, we're going to talk about sufficient causes and necessary causes. A sufficient cause means that that exposure alone will cause the disease. You don't need anything else included. A sufficient cause alone is enough to produce the disease. A necessary cause means that the disease or outcome cannot manifest unless that exposure is present. A cause can be necessary but not sufficient. So you can have a cause that has to be there in order for the disease to develop or the outcome to develop, but it won't, in and of itself, that exposure won't cause the disease to develop. It has to be there in conjunction with some other things. So sufficient, the exposure definitely is by itself can cause the disease. Necessary, that exposure has to be there for the disease to develop, but it has to be there, but it doesn't have to be the only thing that's there. It just has to be there. It may need something else to make the disease manifest. So, most of the time, especially when we're talking about chronic diseases, one exposure or risk factor alone is not enough to cause the development of disease. Usually, it's multifactorial. There are multiple component causes that all work together to then cause you to have the disease. This is definitely the case in almost all chronic conditions. I'm not going to say all of them, but most of them. Let's see. A sufficient cause doesn't have to be one factor. It can be multifactorial. So you may have to have A, B, and C all occur in order to get the disease. Let's look at this kind of graphically. I think it makes it a little bit better. So, in these three pictures, we have A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. All of those are individual risk factors, or individual exposures. They are all component causes for disease X. And this particular component cause A is the only necessary cause. So if you don't have component cause A, if you don't have that exposure, you will not get this disease. Will not happen. Now, A by itself is not enough to give you the disease. So A is necessary. You have to have it. But A must occur in combination with B, C, D, E, F, and G, and some combination of that, in order for you to get the disease. Right? Yes?
So sufficient cause doesn't really ever happen? Or
It does. So let's say if you, get tuberculosis, right? So somebody that has tuberculosis comes and spits in your face.
so that would be
the germs are enough to give you the disease. You just need to have.
Okay.
Now, that's not talking about the fact that, in general speaking, if we're talking about environmental factors, you're more likely to get tuberculosis if you're living in chronic conditions, right? Because of that. But yes, the TB, bacilli, whatever, is enough to actually give you tuberculosis. It is a sufficient cause.
Okay.
So there are 4 types of causal relationships. The first, your exposure can be both necessary and sufficient. So if it's necessary and sufficient, the disease will only occur if the factor is present, and the exposure will always lead to the disease. This doesn't happen that often, just like we were talking about. So it can be necessary and sufficient.
Can you repeat that?
Yes, I can.
Sorry.
So if a factor is necessary and sufficient, having that factor present is the only thing you need to have in order to develop the disease. And if that factor is present, you definitely will develop the disease. It can be necessary but not sufficient. That's what we were talking about a second ago. If it's necessary but not sufficient, the factor must be present for the disease to manifest, but that factor alone will not cause the disease to manifest. It works with other component causes. A factor can be sufficient but not necessary, meaning that just having that exposure alone can cause the disease. However, you don't have to have that exposure to get the disease. There are other things that can cause it as well. So, an example, vitamin B12 deficiency can cause anemia, but there's other things that can cause anemia as well, right? So B12 deficiency alone is a sufficient cause for anemia. But you don't have to have B12 deficiency in order to get anemia. There are other things that can cause it. And then a factor can be neither sufficient nor necessary, meaning that specific factor can combine with other factors to cause the disease. But you don't have to have that factor, and that factor alone will not cause the disease. This is actually the most common thing we see, right? So, being overweight in and of itself does not give you diabetes. There are other ways to get diabetes besides just being overweight. But being overweight in combination with other factors is a risk factor for diabetes. It is a component cause, right? Yeah.
Can you repeat the definition of that one?
For neither sufficient nor necessary, it means if it doesn't have to be sufficient, meaning the disease, you can't get the disease just from having that exposure. And then if it's not necessary, that means it doesn't actually have to be there for you to get the disease anyway.
Is that or something?
Right. So it's neither sufficient nor necessary. Yeah.
So, is there like a genetic predisposition for diabetes, like let's say you can't produce insulin?
Mm-hmm.
So that would be sufficient but not necessary for diabetes?
The genetic predisposition wouldn't necessarily mean that you develop it unless you had a genetic marker that actually...
Yeah.
Yes. So that would be...
sufficient but not necessary.
Yes, because there are other ways for people to get diabetes. Yes. All right. So there's 4 types of factors that we can really talk about that play a part in the causation of disease. So Predisposing factors are those that make a person more susceptible to the disease. These are things like age or sex, or it could be prior illness or certain genetic traits. They make you more likely to get the disease. They make you more susceptible to the disease. Enabling factors are external factors that may contribute to the development of disease. So these are things like being low income, or having poor nutrition, or unsafe housing, other socioeconomic factors. These are external to you, but they can contribute to you getting the disease. So the tuberculosis example, for instance, if you live in really crowded conditions, that enables the transmission of tuberculosis. Precipitating factors are those factors that are associated with the onset of disease. For example, exposure to a specific pathogen or a specific harmful substance. So asbestos exposure is a precipitating factor for mesothelioma, which we all know because we've all seen those lawsuit commercials that are still going on. And then finally, reinforcing factors are those factors that can aggravate an established disease. So like if you have repeated exposures to poor environmental conditions. Yes?
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm. So all of these we can term all of these risk factors, right? In the broadest sense. So a risk factor is any factor that's positive, or that's not positive, that's associated with the development of a disease. So the term risk factor is a broad term for anything that's associated with the development of a disease. We can break it down into these specific types, but just because something is a risk factor doesn't mean it causes the disease. It doesn't even necessarily mean it's a component cause of the disease, though it might be. So how do we tease all this out? If there's multiple causes to the disease, and we can't conduct randomized controlled trials on every single risk factor we're interested in to control for all the other stuff to see if a particular risk factor actually causes the disease, what do we do? Well, Sir Bradford Hill was nice enough to come up with some criteria for causal inference. And I'm sure you've heard me say the word temporality over and over again. I think I say it at least 5 or 6 times every single time we have class. Because it's important. Because temporality means that the cause precedes the effect. So if you cannot establish that your risk factor took place before the outcome developed, you cannot say that two things are causally related. We'll go through all of these individually and talk about what each of them mean. But so we can say time or temporal sequence, but it simply means that your risk factor, your exposure of interest, precedes the outcome in time. And not just by like a day. It precedes the outcome in enough time, that in a reasonable amount of time that the disease could manifest, that could really happen. So if I can't say I smoke 1 cigarette today and I develop lung cancer tomorrow, I probably can't say that that cigarette that I smoked today caused the lung cancer that I developed tomorrow, right? It has to be sufficient amount of time between the exposure and the outcome, and it has to be a sufficient amount of time of the exposure depending on what it is. But you have to be able to demonstrate that your exposure preceded the outcome. All right. Strength of the association. So we have the risk ratio and the odds ratio. Those are the measures that we've been looking at as measures of association. The stronger the association that you see, the more likely it is that the exposure, disease relationship is causal. That does not mean that there wasn't a compounding factor that confused it. So just because you have a strong relationship, does not mean that your exposure caused your outcome. But the stronger the relationship, the larger your risk ratio, the larger your odds ratio, the more likely it is that there is a real causal relationship there. Because the less likely it is that that relationship is entirely due to confounding. Another point, just because a relationship is weak doesn't mean that it's not causal. So these are guidelines. Yeah.
Can you give me a whole of that?
Of a weak relationship?
Because my inclination is to kind of give that data the boot.
Well, so there are other reasons that you might be seeing your weak relationship. Part of it might just be because of the way the study was designed. Part of it might have been because you didn't give people enough of a dose of the exposure. Right, so you could have an exposure that caused the outcome, but if people just got a little bit. So if you're worried that some toxin in the air caused lung disease, but the people that you're studying had one breath of it, they might not have had enough exposure to actually cause the disease. So you would have seen a weak relationship there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not causing it. But the stronger the association that you see, the larger the risk ratio, the odds ratio, the more likely it is that that relationship's not going to disappear when you control for confounding. All right, dose-response relationship. This is why I was so excited when you guys, which group was it that broke it down by differing doses? Because if you can demonstrate that the strength of association increases the more of a dose somebody receives, you have strong causal evidence, right? So the more cigarettes a person smokes, the more likely they are to get lung cancer. It's called the dose-response relationship. Now, you won't always see this. Some things have just a threshold effect. So if it has a threshold effect, you're exposed, nothing happens, and then all of a sudden you hit that threshold of exposure, and now you'll get the disease, right? So you wouldn't see a dose-response relationship in that particular instance. But, like the other criteria, if you can demonstrate this happening, you can demonstrate the more of this drug you get, the more likely you are to get better, that's strong evidence that the drug is causing you to get better. Simply means that you keep coming to the same conclusion based on different studies. So a ton of different researchers have studied this particular research question, and they've done it using a bunch of different study designs, and everybody keeps getting the same answer. That strongly supports that there's a causal relationship. Basically, because each different study has different types of bias that are associated with it. So if you can show that you keep seeing the same relationship, regardless of the study design, you've been able to say, okay, we've controlled for different types of bias in each of these different study designs. And regardless of which type of bias might have been at play, we still keep finding the same answer. That's strong evidence that there's a causal association. Biologic plausibility means that there are known or postulated biological mechanisms that explain your exposure-disease relation. We have some good reason for thinking that what happens is happening. Now, biologic plausibility is more important when you're talking about medical things and less important when you're talking about psychological and social things that you could be studying, right? Because you may not have a biological mechanism for why self-esteem causes people to gain weight, or low self-esteem causes people to gain weight or something, right? If that's your hypothesis. So that may not be something where you have a biological plausibility. But this does transfer, you should still have a good theory as to why something's happening. But if the results you find make sense in the context of what is known in science in the greater scheme, the stronger your ability to say that we probably think this association is causal. Reversibility. This simply means that if you take the exposure away, that then you find a reduced risk of disease. So when the exposure is present, you have an increased risk. If those people that were at an increased risk, you take the exposure away, now they're no longer at an increased risk, they're at a decreased risk. You have stronger support that the exposure causes the disease. So remember when we talked about last week the crossover designs, where you had two treatment groups, and treatment group 1 was given drug A, and treatment group B was given drug B, and then you stopped and you switched them. You switched the treatment group. That helps you demonstrate reversibility. So you took the drug, you're giving someone treatment, drug A, and their blood pressure goes down. And you take drug A away and their blood pressure goes back up. You have a lot more evidence that drug A is causing a decrease in blood pressure, right? Now, reversibility is not something easily demonstrated when you're talking about behavioral interventions.
Like reversibility also be like negative sometimes, because then like what if you're like become dependent upon a drug to get like a desired effect rather than just helping people reach that naturally? So like with like beta blockers and like blood pressure, once you start taking them, it's kind of like you're dependent on them the rest of
Yes,
your
well,
life.
so that's why none of these are hard and fast criteria, right? So it's like, the more of these that you kind of meet, the better. But things can be causally related without meeting all of these criteria. The only criteria that you absolutely have to establish is temporality. The rest of them are just suggestions that we would like to see, but are not always going to be the case because depending. So reversibility also, if you have a behavioral intervention, right? You're trying to increase someone's self-esteem. I don't know why that just coming to mind. So you're trying to increase someone's self-esteem, and you give them this behavioral intervention. You can take the intervention away, but they probably still are maintaining some effects of that intervention, and so they're not going to plummet. Their self-esteem is not going to plummet just because you took it away. So in interventions like that, your intervention still could have caused their self-esteem to get better, but we're not going to be able to demonstrate that causal relationship through reversibility. So this is one of the criteria, and so part of it is you have to understand what you're studying and understand which of these criteria are most appropriate based on what you're studying. All right, and then finally we have study design. So we kind of alluded to this earlier, but different study designs provide stronger or weaker evidence. So we've talked about kind of experimental studies being deemed the gold standard of study designs, the best type of study designs. Basically that's because they're highly controlled, right? So we know we can establish the temporal sequence of events. We know we have done our best to control for other factors. And so in experimental study design, we can be more confident that what we're doing, that our intervention caused the outcome. So you will see large, huge trials or whatever, where people at the end of an experimental study say, I have established causality. And that's not necessarily an incorrect statement. But you still want to be careful because experimental designs, like all study designs, are susceptible to different types of bias. Cohort studies are the next kind of strongest study design, mainly because cohort studies still allow us to establish the temporal sequence, right, of events. Case control studies are kind of next in line. They're more susceptible to certain types of biases, and they don't allow us to establish the temporal sequence. And then we have cross-sectional and ecological studies. We've kind of talked about all of those as we've gone on. But the stronger your study design, the more confident you can be about saying that this relationship might be causal. And this is just a little kind of fun picture of what we could possibly see as hierarchy of experimental evidence.